All right, so in this final module for the course, we are going to talk about the politics of voting and the politics of elections. We're going to start out here with the politics of voting, right? I'm going to say the obvious here. In a constitutional democracy, voting is absolutely central, right? And when we think about that democratic ethos, right, at the center of that ethos is popular sovereignty, right? Power to the people. And what's a key way to empower we the people, right? Universal adult suffrage. Let's start there. All right, so we'll start at the beginning here, as we often do. What do we know about suffrage at the founding of the American Republic? Well, heck, we've talked about this. Historians estimate that around 5 or 6% of us could vote after we ratified the Constitution and got it up and running, i.e., in this case, white men with significant property. Now that began to change, as we've discussed, as early as the aftermath of the election of 1800, where the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans narrowly defeated the Federalists. And with that, right, because Jefferson was an advocate of an expanded suffrage, we started to expand suffrage in the aftermath of that election. Initially expanding that suffrage to white men with either lower amounts of property or with no property at all. What a radical concept. Back then it was. Black men were guaranteed the right to vote in the aftermath of the Civil War through the 15th Amendment, as we've discussed, in 1870. Now, what we know about that, right, is that was enforced during Reconstruction, but Reconstruction failed after about a dozen years. Right, this guarantee of the right to vote for black men, but certainly not black women or women at all, right? It's not actually realized except for a brief interlude, sadly, and then we go backwards again, right? The rise of Jim Crow, the KKK, and all of that. Women were guaranteed the right to vote in 1920 through a constitutional amendment, of course, through the suffrage movement. Black Americans finally guaranteed the right to vote in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And those 18 and older were guaranteed the right to vote in 1971 through a constitutional amendment. And ever since then, we've effectively had universal adult suffrage, except, right, it turns out that we still exclude, depending on what state you live in, we still exclude a chunk of the adult citizens in America, those who are either felons currently incarcerated or those who are ex-felons. And generally speaking, you're not going to find this to be surprising at all. The more conservative the state, the more likely they are to bar ex-felons from voting. Almost all states ban current felons from voting, except for I think maybe 2. And once you get to ex-felons, right, the more conservative states will ban them and the more liberal states will not. And think about it, right? There's going to be a racially disproportionate impact of those policies, right? We haven't gotten into that here. This is an introductory course. It's not an advanced course on criminal justice. But if it were, we would know that disproportionately our incarcerated population is disproportionately black by quite a margin. It's actually shocking, and not in a good way. So when you do disenfranchise ex-felons, you're systematically mostly disenfranchising black men, to put it bluntly. I know that just a few years ago down in Florida, we the people had voted on a ballot measure to automatically re-enfranchise an ex-felon, right? That once they became an ex-felon, they would again regain the right to vote. So that was the ballot measure, but it was worded fairly loosely. And under the leadership, I believe at the time of Governor Ron DeSantis, early days of his tenure there as governor, the legislature, I think, got too clever by half and defined, what does it mean to be an ex-felon? Have you paid all of your fines and restitution? Have you paid for your incarceration in all the jurisdictions where you were convicted of crimes? They came up with a very stringent definition of what constitutes being an ex-felon. And because, right, most ex-felons have essentially no money and no particular job prospects, the ability to pay for your incarceration and to pay restitution to your victims is often out of reach, right? So although I think the ballot measure was meant to re-enfranchise these people, the legislature said, screw that. You know, quite honestly, I'll be blunt here. This is a Republican-dominated legislature led by a Republican governor. And their view, I think, was these ex-felons, you know, do they really deserve to vote, to get the vote back again? And most of them are black men. You know, they're not going to vote Republican. Why would we allow them access to the ballot? So they've made sure that for the most part, that ballot measure has been meaningless. So that's the way that went down in Florida some years ago. Also true, right, that we've seen more broadly a push in states with a Republican trifecta, i.e. Republicans control of the governor's office and the state legislature, both houses. There's been a pretty hard push, right, to limit access to the ballot through, we'll see momentarily, what are called administrative burdens, right? Erect as many administrative burdens as possible in the name of election integrity to make it more difficult to gain access to the ballot. And we've seen that play out, right, with the pandemic, right? There was an expansion of access to the ballot through mail-in voting, right? In some states like Nevada, that ballot mailed to everyone who's registered to vote. And that has increased turnout significantly in the last few election cycles. For a political scientist, that's exciting. We're like, yay, the more turnout, the better. Right, but Republicans have seen that as counter to their interests. There's no evidence that it is. The evidence is that when you expand access to the ballot, both parties benefit. General turnout goes up, you know. So it seems to be party neutral in impact. But the conception here by the Republicans is if you expand access to suffrage, that's bad for Republicans. It's not, but that's the belief, and beliefs are what drive politics. And you've seen, right, within the Republican Party, this intense internecine battle over exactly this question of, all right, access to the ballot was expanded during the pandemic. Should we continue with those expanded forms of access, or should we go back to the old school way of making it more difficult to vote? Trump has been on the side of let's go back to making it more difficult to vote in the erroneous belief that it hurts Republicans. Many Republican leaders are arguing the opposite, that Trump's claims about mail-in ballots being hopelessly fraudulent are not supported by actual data or evidence. And I think Trump has been somewhat sort of gotten enough pushback that he's kind of conceded that, okay, do mail-in ballots, because otherwise if you don't, it hurts Republicans, and it's here to stay. Things have changed. But he just recently gave a speech where he's like, go ahead and do that, but I still think it's deeply fraudulent and highly questionable. Right? And Republican leaders are like, no, don't step on our message of trying to encourage more Republicans to vote by mail. Don't step on the lead there. Come on, man. But that's a battle within the Republican Party. All right, so next slide here. What do we want to talk about? We want to talk about voting turnout, given how central it is to our democracy, right? In general, in political science, the argument's going to be the more turnout, the better. There are some, even in the profession, who embrace what's called democratic elitism, the argument that maybe we don't want everybody voting, but that's a minority in the profession. I would say in general, if you're a political scientist, you would like to see 100% turnout. How cool would that be? Turns out, right, that's not really achievable. Historically, in recent decades, what we've seen is in a midterm election, right, where the presidency is not at stake, like 2018, 2022. In those midterm elections, you get about 40% turnout of eligible voters. And in presidential election years like 2016 and 2020, voting turnout has been historically at around 60%. Right, so those are okay numbers, right? They're not 100%. They're pretty low in a midterm. That's a little discouraging. They're decently high in a presidential year. That's mildly encouraging. But as I've said, right, with the advent of the pandemic and eased access to voting by mail and automatic sending out of ballots in some states like Nevada to those who are registered to vote, turnout has jumped. Right? For a political scientist, generally speaking, that's a positive. And it's been good for both political parties. No evidence that it has partisan bias. 2020, right, presidential year, turnout was 66%. That's very exciting for us here in political science. And even in 2018, a midterm, it was at 50%. Right, so we've seen a jump, a bit of a jump in turnout in both presidential election cycles and midterm election cycles. Very cool. I just hope we don't see backsliding going forward, but we'll see. Note the role of administrative burdens. In some states, because it turns out, right, states have a big role to play in administering elections. That goes back to the founding of the Constitution, right, and our federal system. There are some national standards, mostly laid out through either federal laws or the Constitution. But an awful lot of the details, right, are left up to the states. So access to the ballot varies quite a bit from one state to the next. That's a question that we might have, right, about elections in a democracy. I think we're one of the few, maybe the only democracy in the world that leaves so much of this up to subnational units of government, in our case, states. Feels to me like something this fundamental shouldn't vary from state to state, but it does. Administrative burdens, right? Things that sort of make it more difficult for citizens to get access to the ballot. Typically, right, justified in the name of electoral integrity. But some say, well, that's really just one side in particular trying to discourage voting by those who they consider to be undesirable, young people, people of color, those with less income, because those are the groups, right, that are more likely to be discouraged by administrative burdens. And there's a number of examples I list there. Our book lists a lot more, so look there for the details. All sorts of ways to come at that. And in a lot of red states, they've gotten very creative, coming up with new administrative burdens. And to me, as someone who's very attentive to American history, it harkens back to how suffrage was denied to black men after the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, through things like grandfather clauses or literacy tests or poll taxes, right? Justified as legitimate administrative burdens, but really designed, right, subtextually to make it more difficult for certain groups to get access to the ballot. I hear echoes of that in today's efforts to impose more administrative burdens. History never really goes away. Note the role of race in voting turnout, and we'll look at some other demographic categories in the next slide. But here I'm going to note it because I think it's so important. Our text notes this information as well. Check that out. In 2016, as a good exemplar election, turnout among whites was at 65%, blacks 59%, right? So pretty close, but right, with a definite advantage for white Americans in terms of who votes, end of the day, de facto. Latinos at 48%, and Asian Americans at 48%, right? So quite a drop off there. Especially once you get past blacks and whites, right? Significant underparticipation by Latinos and Asian Americans. And this is looking at voting eligible population. Now note that the Latino community here and the Asian American community are disproportionately more likely to be recent immigrants, right, versus black and white Americans. And the data show that if you're a recent immigrant, you're less likely to vote. And the longer you've been here, the more likely you are to vote, right? So that's probably some of it. If we're trying to explain why Latino and Asian American participation lags between black and white participation, some of it's clearly that. And then related to that, right, because most who come over as immigrants are younger people, the Latino community in America is significantly younger than either the black or the white community. Similarly for Asian Americans, disproportionately younger than either white or black Americans. And we'll see in the next slide that age has a big impact on who votes and who doesn't, right? The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. So the fact that Latinos and Asian Americans are disproportionately young makes them less likely to vote. Those are at least two explanatory reasons why you get underparticipation by Latinos and Asian Americans. What are some other factors that influence who votes in American politics and in elections and who doesn't? Income. Income is a major determinant of who votes and who doesn't vote. This is in our text, a graph spread out, or a table spread out over 2 pages, 534 and 533. Income is a big one. I just chose a few income categories there. There's more in our book. Those making under $10,000 a year vote at a rate of 41%. Those making between 40 and 50K a year vote at the rate of 62%. Those making over 150K vote at a rate of over 80%. Over 80%. So look at that gap, right? The most affluent among us are almost exactly twice as likely to vote as the poorest among us. Right, so income has a huge impact on who votes and who doesn't. And there's something sadly ironic about that, right? Who needs, sort of the benefits that you get out of engaging in politics, i.e. access to scarce resources? Turns out the most affluent are going to get the most attention from elected officials, right? Because they're the ones most likely to vote. Who is likely to get the least out of our political system because they under-participate? The poorest among us. And so it actually reinforces pre-existing economic inequalities. Super unfortunate and dysfunctional. Education, a huge role, as you can see, quite large indeed. Those American citizens with less than a 9th grade education participate at the rate of 32%. I think these are from the 2016 election, again. 32% among those with the least education, 52% for those who have a high school degree, those with a 4-year degree, 74% turnout rate, and those with a graduate school education, 80%. So again, right, a huge gap. Those with the least education participate at a rate of 32%. Those with a graduate school education, 80%, right? About 2.5 times more likely to vote if you're highly educated versus relatively lightly educated. And you can see how these things, right, sort of combine too, right? Which groups are most likely to have the most income, right? Those with the most education. So these are self-reinforcing categories that determine who participates and who doesn't, and therefore who gets more out of our system and who gets less. It reinforces inequalities. Look at the age, the role of age there, right? The youngest among us who can vote, 18 to 24, 43% rate. 25 to 44, 57%. 45 to 64, 67%. 65 to 74, 73%. Right, so quite an age gap there. The youngest among us, 43%. The oldest among us, 73%. Huge gap in participation rates. Is that why young people don't tend to get a lot out of the system? I think that's a reason why. Is this a reason why I think we overcommit our scarce resources to the elderly? It's because they're so likely to vote? I believe that's a factor. And then finally, kind of interesting, marital status. I think I had referenced this earlier. Turns out that among Americans who are married, They vote in elections at a rate of around 69%, which is quite high. Those who've never been married participate at a rate of 49%. Now, a lot of that, right, is going to be age, isn't it? Right? Because those who are married are more likely to be older on average than those who've never been married. Okay, so that's some good stuff to know here. Demographic influences on who votes and who doesn't. Okay, so what do we see here in terms of demographic influences on how one votes? And again, I know some students are uncomfortable talking about demography and politics. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say to that. Uh, so social scientists in general and political scientists in particular, we look for patterns in the forest. Okay, and if there's a pattern, we need to talk about it because that's what we do. We don't really analyze individual trees. We look at patterns in the forest. All right, so with that out of the way, um, does race have a substantial influence on how one votes in elections? Yeah, it's always had a big influence on how people vote in America. Um, so we know, right? And I'll need to pin down those numbers, but whites, right, as a group, pattern. Whites as a group went pretty heavily for Donald Trump. Black Americans went quite heavily for Kamala Harris, although not as heavily as they've gone for the Democratic candidate in previous presidential elections, right? Trump was able to peel away some of that support. It made a difference. It made a difference. Good for him. Good for him, right? Various racial groups. I know this makes them uncomfortable, but various racial groups, right? They want both parties to compete for their support. That's important. You don't want a party that can take you for granted or that writes you off. Latinos, right, went pretty heavily for Harris, by a decent margin. But again, right, not the same margins as in previous presidential elections. Trump peeled away some Latino support. Good for him. Good for him. Right, we're seeing some depolarization of racialized voting in America. Great. But that means, right, for Democrats, they need to do better among white people. They need to make up for that loss in other areas with gains in where the most votes are, which is in the white community. Asian Americans similarly went pretty heavily for Harris, but again, Trump did win over some compared to previous presidential election cycles. Boy, I had something else I wanted to say about that, but damned if I can remember now. All right, on gender, right? I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. The gap might be a little surprising, but we do have quite a gender gap here. Um, Women went decisively for Kamala Harris. Um, Men went decisively for Donald Trump. That's quite a gender gap. If you go back to when I was coming of age politically, 1980, Reagan versus Carter, there was no gender gap at all. Men and women voted just about exactly the same in terms of who they voted for president. So that's emerged only in recent decades, and it's become quite wide, as you can see. Age, right? You can see that as well. Again, We see here that young people went decisively for Kamala Harris. Um, Older Americans like myself, although of course not me, but we're looking at patterns, not individuals. Older Americans went pretty heavily for Donald Trump. That's quite a gap, quite a gap. Again, that makes Democrats right hopeful for the future. It makes Republicans a little concerned about the future. Although again, as with some of those other demographic variables, right, Trump did peel off more young people than in previous cycles away from Democrats. So that's interesting. Yeah, basically, right, Trump gained incrementally versus 2020 in a number of demographic areas, and that was the difference in the election. He improved among black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, younger voters, um, and that was the difference. Finally, education. Now, those with a graduate degree, which for the Democrats, there aren't enough Americans with graduate degrees, because as you can see, right, Harris won those with graduate degrees, law degrees, medical degrees, PhDs, master's degrees, and whatever, right? She won that group by about 2-1. Right? But her problem was there's not that many Americans with graduate degrees. And of course, right, those with high school or less, Trump won decisively. As Trump said back in 2016, right, I love the poorly educated. There's a reason he said that, right? That's where he gets most of his votes. And I do think it's one of the reasons why he and Republicans in general have become pretty hostile towards higher education, right? Their perception, grounded in data, is that the more education you have, the more likely you are to vote Democratic. So they are, for cultural reasons, of course, but also political reasons, they're very skeptical of higher education. Very, very skeptical indeed. All right, that'll do it. Thanks.